Okay, good morning and welcome to the 32nd meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have one public item on our agenda today, which is our final evidence session on the cost effectiveness of public inquiries. We are joined today by Kate Forbes, MSP, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Economy and Gaelic, and Donald McGilvray, Director of Safe Communities. And just arriving are Emma Thompson, Solicitor, Scottish Government Legal Director, and Mary McCormick, Civil Courts, Justice Transformation and Inquiries. I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting and invite the Deputy First Minister to make a short opening statement. Good morning, Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much, Convener, for the opportunity to give evidence today. And the committees always hold very interesting evidence sessions, but this one in particular, I think, is something that I have followed with some interest over the last few weeks because I think it's a really important issue. You will know that public inquiries play a vital role in establishing what has happened, restoring public trust and recommending improvements. But quite obviously, and I know this has been a theme, they need to deliver value for money as well. And I very much welcome the committee's consideration of how best to achieve that. Decisions to hold public inquiries are never taken lightly. We always consider alternatives first, like non-statutory reviews, independent panels or other mechanisms that may be quicker, more flexible and less costly. Those options are then carefully assessed in light of each case's circumstances, and as part of that we try to engage directly with affected parties like victims and survivors to understand their perspectives. Obviously, the legal framework for public inquiries is set by the UK Inquiries Act 2005 and the Inquiries Scotland Rules 2007. Under the 2005 Act, ministers are required to meet the costs of holding inquiries, and chairs have a duty to avoid unnecessary costs. The costs of an inquiry are largely shaped by the independent chair's decisions on how it should be run, but the scope and the remit established by ministers set the parameters in which these decisions are made. The terms of reference agreed at the outset are the key lever that ministers have to help ensure an inquiry is cost-effective and delivers timely outcomes. And so we need to strike a careful balance at that point, offering clear direction, but also not compromising the inquiry's independence. I know you've heard calls for indicative timescales to be set for inquiries, and I think that setting expectations on duration could be one way to reassure those affected and help manage public expectations. We've also got to be mindful of ensuring that inquiries have the time they need to thoroughly investigate and to follow up on evidence that emerges. Once an inquiry is established, it's completely independent of ministers. There is a sponsor team within the Scottish Government who provides the budget for the inquiry and maintains regular contact with the inquiry team. We've also produced guidance to support the establishment and operation of inquiries, which sets out ways to deliver value for money on issues like procuring IT and agreeing leases, although those are ultimately operational decisions for the chair. Every public inquiry incurs unavoidable costs, including staffing, accommodation, legal services and engagement. But decisions on those matters are taken by the chair. Other drivers of costs are more challenging to predict, like the length of time taken to gather evidence, the number of hearings and the complexity of drafting reports. Some inquiries require the provision of trauma-informed support for victims, witnesses and inquiry staff. As the committee has heard during their evidence session, inquiries can generate costs for other public bodies and core participants too. Under the 2005 Act, there is no fixed mechanism for monitoring the implementation of recommendations made by inquiries, but our practice is to publish a response to the inquiry's final report, setting out which recommendations are being accepted. A team within the government is then responsible for overseeing the delivery of those recommendations. Where recommendations are directed at a particular public body, it's also normal for that body to respond to those recommendations. Public inquiries are specifically designed to support an independent, thorough and trusted investigation of the facts. I recognise, however, that there may be tensions between building confidence that an inquiry has the necessary time to conduct a thorough investigation and to follow evidence where it may lead, and value for money. We must therefore strike a careful balance, offering clear direction without compromising the inquiry's independence. And I, to that end, am really interested in the conclusions that the committee comes to on getting that balance right. The committee will also be aware of the proposed Public Office Accountability Bill, which seeks to strengthen transparency, frankness and candour obligations in public inquiries. Those reforms aim to ensure that inquiries, whether statutory or non-statutory, are supported by clear duties on public bodies to provide full and accurate information, while giving chairs additional powers to compel evidence and enforce candour without the need for a full statutory process. That could make non-statutory inquiries a more viable and more viable and cost-effective option in some cases. The bill also gives ministers the power to extend the duty to more types of investigations. And for those who do not comply with the duty, the bill sets out clear criminal sanctions. It's obviously a UK government bill, but we have been working very constructively with the UK government on this, and we want to work with the UK Cabinet Office going forward to consider the wider policy and operational framework around inquiries following the report on those issues to the from the House of Lords. So, all that's to say, very happy to answer questions. I've got a team with me, particularly if it comes into the detail of any specific inquiries, because not all of them sit directly under me, but more than happy to answer any of the committee's questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was very helpful, and that alone generated quite a lot of questions that I would want to ask. I'm not going to ask all the questions I want to ask because I know my colleagues are quite keen. I don't want to tread on their toes, but I might come in after them as well as before them. One thing I would touch on at the start is about the issue of guidance for public inquiries. Now, I understand that this was laid in August 2024, but our committee, despite having started an inquiry a couple of months before, we were informed of its existence on 30th of May. We were then advised that the guidance wouldn't be ready until October, and it's only just been published. Why is it taking 14 months to publish guidance on this?
So, as you say, the date is, as you've outlined, laid in Parliament on the 5th of August 2024. In terms of the timescales, that is obviously setting out a number of areas that the committee is interested in. In terms of the approach for bringing that to the committee's attention, my apologies if that was not done in an appropriate way. But in terms of the guidance itself, these are very complex issues. So the guidance was intended to try and get through the tension that I outlined that existed between the operational independence of inquiries, and you'll appreciate that I engage with the chairs of public inquiries, and in my engagement I have to be really careful and really clear about where the chair is fully operationally independent to make his or her own decisions, and where I can't. And the guidance is designed to try and get through some of that tension. Appreciate that, but I mean, given the fact that we started inquiry in April, it seems a bit odd that the government only sent us a guidance 6 months later. I mean, on that, I mean, it seems a bit. One would have thought that the government would have, said to us, not only do we have this guidance, which they took 2 months to do after we started it, but then actually we didn't receive it till October. In fact, members only sent it late last week. I mean, I think that's a bit unsatisfactory, is it not? Yeah, can I apologise then for not sending you that on a more timely basis? I don't know if anybody's got anything else to add, and our apologies for not drawing your attention to that earlier.
Thank you. Now, one of the reasons for prompting this inquiry was obviously the kind of concern about the cost of this, and we've seen it in the media over the last 24 hours in particular, 258.8 million since 2007 in public inquiries in Scotland, over 1.5 billion in the UK over the same kind of time period. So these are becoming increasingly expensive. And one of the issues I want to talk about is opportunity cost. So if you think about the police, they gave evidence to this committee in the spring. They were not very happy, to put it mildly, the Scottish Police Federation, about the impact on their ability to deliver services. One of the issues, of course, with public inquiries, if it's, for example, inquiry that falls on the police, it comes out of their budget. So Sheku Bayou for alone has cost them over £25 million, and as you know, with the resignation of Lord Brackendale, that situation remains kind of uncertain. They said, that £25 million is equivalent to 500 police officers for a year. So when inquiries are actually started, what cognizance is actually taken in terms of whether or not, what the impact will be on the services of the organisation that's been impacted. So what we also, incidentally, Emma Caldwell, which is also going to impact on the police, and there are certain politicians in here who are also calling for an inquiry into grooming gangs. So we could end up with 3 inquiries if that goes ahead, all impacting on police resource.
And I'm very conscious of that, and I heard the evidence that police gave on this matter. And you know, often, we've all been through it, often the demands for an inquiry are not just from internally within government. There's often a widespread call across the parliamentary chamber and beyond. And I think that these issues that you've just identified are matters that we all need to be cognisant of when calling for an inquiry or deliberating over whether a public inquiry is the best vehicle for examining an issue. I went through in my opening remarks what some of the alternatives are. And you talked about the costs for the inquiry itself. Now, costs are determined to a large extent by how an inquiry is run by an independent chair. And that's why we don't set a fixed budget or a cost limit for an inquiry. You can see in a debate like this why that might be attractive. But as soon as you start broaching that, I think publicly, it undermines the thoroughness with which an inquiry might want to pursue an issue. So I think it does start to infringe on the independence of it. In terms of the opportunity costs for public bodies, I saw the evidence that NHS Scotland also gave to you, I believe, and these are, you know, I mean, it's for public bodies to determine whether to apply to be core participants in some cases and the extent of legal representation required. So there are some areas which are for public bodies to determine. But I disagree with you in terms of the costs that are not just there for the inquiry to be met for the inquiry, but also for other public bodies that might be involved. And we're in the midst of a budget process just now. So as I go into that budget process, I'm engaging with the Finance Secretary on what budget I believe I will need for inquiries. But these are demand-led budgets entirely. So whilst there may be forecasts at this point in procedures, those forecasts will inevitably be revised, and sometimes they will be revised also in terms of how many more years an inquiry might last. So it's not just about the cost on an annual basis, but it's also about how long the cost lasts for a public body.
Sweden manages to struggle since 1982 by having a 2-year timescale limit on their inquiries, and there doesn't seem to be any collapse in public support for that. They also managed to keep their inquiries down to a fraction of ours. Their COVID inquiry, I think, cost less than a couple of £1 million and was sorted within about 8 months, for example. There is absolutely no need to have inquiries that go on year after year after year. How does that actually deliver justice for people? And the point about the opportunity cost is there are people in our society who will not be getting the policing services they need and deserve because resources are being diverted into inquiries. And it seems to me, whenever I hear ministers talk about inquiries, arguments for or against them, I never hear any of this talk about opportunity costs, frankly. There's always another reason why it should or should not take place. But surely if we're going to have big inquiries that are going to take years and have a huge impact, is there not an argument for a central fund for inquiries so that you're not always impinging on frontline services? People can say, well, if the police got something wrong, then it should come out of their budget. But it's not the police directly that are impacted, it's the public that are impacted because they don't have those officers in their communities if they're being redirected. We had very compelling evidence about officers being frankly overwhelmed, the ones that are left on the front line because so many of their colleagues have been tied up in this Sheku Bayu case, for example. I think it was 68 detectives or some ludicrous number for for an incident, which, as Michael Mara pointed out, 15 or 20 people may be involved in, So I mean, that's the issue. I mean, justice isn't just one-sided about the people who are calling for the inquiry and deliver it. It's about wider society, surely, and the impact it has on them. And if other societies and countries can deliver cost-effective Timmins inquiries, why can't we? Why is it the only area of public sector where the budget Social Security can argue to a degree is also demand-led, but this is almost limitless. It's like whether it costs 5 million or 50 million. Or I mean, what's Sheikh Bayagoni cost in the end? You know, 100 million maybe. I mean, you know, and who's the justice going to be delivered for at the end of the day, if justice indeed is seen to be delivered? For the policewoman who was assaulted, for the family of Mr. Bayou. How is it? I mean, that's just one inquiry. The Emma Caldwell thing, her own mother has said that she'll be dead by the time the inquiry concludes. So who's justice being delivered for?
So I think the points that you raised, and just before I answer, can I just be really clear that in my answer I am not discussing any particular inquiry. Just really think that's important before I give my thoughts in response, that this is not a reflection on any independent inquiry, because I am the sponsor for some of these inquiries and I don't want that to undermine the chair. But I think I'm certainly not coming here in a position of defensiveness. And it's why I welcome the inquiry's consideration of this issue, because I think that these matters merit very serious consideration. We, on an annual basis, I told you about the engagement that we have with the inquiries in terms of budgeting for that. So in my budget alone, if one area of demand-led budgeting continues to grow and grow and grow, there's nowhere else for it to go but to squeeze on some of the other areas in my portfolio, and there may not be a direct correlation between some areas in my portfolio and inquiries, but if that demand-led budget increases significantly, and because of the independence of the inquiries, I am under obligation to meet those costs irrespective, so long as the chair understands their statutory duty to avoid unnecessary costs. That is a situation that government is in. You will understand that in other portfolios where, for example, there's a sponsor team for Police Scotland or a sponsor team for NHS Scotland, as there is, there will be similar conversations going on about the budget requirements, the budget forecasts, and meeting their obligations within public inquiries will be part of those conversations. But all that's to say that I am extremely interested in what the committee concludes in its recommendations, because if we are going to move forward and make any changes, and you will appreciate I'm always up for implementing recommendations that committees come up with, but if we are to move forward, I think inquiries in particular, which are so often backed on a cross-party basis and on a cross-societal basis, need to therefore have a cross-party discussion about weighing up these tensions. Okay, but people, when they clamour for a public inquiry, don't think it'll be 5 or 10 years before they get an outcome. And when it does take 5 or 10 years, you know, a lot of them are dissatisfied, A, the length of time it's taken, and B, the fact that recommendations are not always implemented. There might be one government brings an inquiry in to get it off its desk, but it's another government that ends up in office when this comes in. But in terms of practicalities, in terms of saving money, well, first of all, I think indicative timescales should be, because there should be a discipline in terms of actually public inquiries like there is everywhere else. You know, I mean, the NHS has to work to budgets, and you know, even in areas where they're saving people's lives. So I don't see why inquiries can't have at least a strong indicative budget and timescale. But let's look at, for example, some areas we can save money. First of all, there seems to be a reinvention of the wheel, which numerous witnesses have talked about. So when an inquiry is called, there doesn't seem to be any central body or resource in terms of people or facilities or training so that they can get started. I mean, what happens when an inquiry is agreed is it might take a year or 18 months before it even starts, because there's all this kind of faffing around at the start. So that's one area. Another area is solicitors. Now, we know about the huge amount of money that solicitors are paid in terms of this, but my understanding is that solicitors and counsel who rely on funding from the Scottish Government are on a reduced hourly rate and have their fees poured over, which is right because it's public money. But other bodies who are also publicly funded, such as health boards, understand are paying their counsel commercial rates. So it seems to me that one way to save money would be for all lawyers paid out of public funds who are direct from the government, or indeed indirectly through the government,
should be subject to the same hourly rates and the same careful scrutiny of fees. Would that not be a way forward for a start?
I think there's 3 questions in that, and I want to answer them all. So can I just, you started off by saying that the public don't realise that when asking for a public inquiry it could take 5 to 10 years. Well, I'd be astonished if the public are not aware of how long public inquiries take, because it is quite obvious, if you look at any recent examples, that they're not quick. So I'm not.
They don't necessarily think that's going to happen with their inquiry, though. They think it's an open and shut, perhaps.
The point is that public inquiries are very unique, and I think you are right in saying that often people call for public inquiries thinking that that is the only route to establish the facts. Actually, it's not the only route to establish the facts, and it becomes the ultimate means of confirming what has happened, whereas there may be, I said in my opening statement, there may be a more flexible and cost-effective, but nevertheless thorough alternative to public inquiries. The other part to this is around public inquiries that have taken a considerable length of time, but if you look at why, it immediately becomes obvious. So, whilst not casting any comment on the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, the thorough approach that the inquiry has taken, not just to the issue in its generalities, but in terms of individual institutions and looking at what happened within those institutions, and that has formed different chapters, different modules, it immediately becomes obvious. And I think as a society, it's actually an indictment on us that there is so much to investigate in terms of child abuse, historic child abuse in Scotland. And then obviously there's been demands for specific consideration of other institutions like Fernethy, and so that has now become part of the child abuse inquiry. So I think that when talking about some of these points, you do have to then start to apply them to the inquiries that are currently live, because the tendency is to say that all of these rules should apply to future inquiries but shouldn't apply to our current inquiries, because everybody feels passionately about the inquiries that are currently taking place. Second, on solicitors' fees, I'll maybe come to Dawn, if that's okay. The second question was around training and expertise. So I understand the point that you're making. So the same sponsor team are now working on different inquiries. So rather than a new sponsor team being set up for brand new inquiries and therefore having to go through the process of learning how to do it, we now have essentially the same sponsor team working on Sheku Bayou and working on the Caldwell inquiry. So they just draw on a lot of their learning. So we avoid the points that you mentioned in terms of a new team learning how to do things differently. Can I ask about solicitors' fees? Because this is a common recurring question.
So I'm hoping my colleague from SGLD will keep me right here, but the power in the Act essentially relates to fees paid by the inquiry. So the legal power that ministers have for setting fees relates to costs paid by the inquiry to core participants that are funded by the inquiry. The power does not extend to core participants that are funding their own legal costs. The duty on those bodies, say Police Scotland in the case of Sheku Bayou, is to, is a normal public sector duty of best value to get the best, the most competitive rates they can for the legal costs that they incur. That's the legal framework as it stands, as I understand it.
So that's a flaw really in the legislation, is it not? Because when the taxpayer can be paying 2 separate rates, for counsel, in the same inquiry.
Yeah. And, the legislation could be changed, but it would take primary legislation to change that situation as it stands, is my understanding of it.
Yeah.
I think we could, sorry to come in, I think we could explore what could be changed in terms of the secondary legislation as well, because there are inquiries rules and they can cover a ward of expenses. So, that is an avenue that could be considered.
And we're talking about UK legislation, so what room does the Scottish Government have to manoeuvre in such issues?
Well, whenever I spend a lot of time with these folks in rooms, understanding the limits on what I can do as a minister. I have had to go through that process because there have been calls for changes to terms of reference. I've gone through that process because of concerns about costs. I am very conscious of the limitations within which I operate because the legislation is very fixed. So, in terms of changing legislation, I don't know if anyone's got anything else to add to that. So, we could go through a process. Obviously, if there is an appetite, I think, from Parliament, particularly off the back of this committee's recommendations, to make fundamental changes, I think there would be an openness from government to consider those. It does need to be done, I think, on a cross-party basis. So there is scope to change it, but through primary legislation.
Okay, I mean, and John Sturrock, KC, said when he was giving evidence that there's a need for education, understanding and clarity about the purpose of inquiries, and ministers perhaps being a bit more focused and clear about what they hope to achieve in inquiries and what the public is entitled to expect from them.
Well, I would query that in terms of the substantive terms of reference, because as we draft, during the drafting of the terms of reference, which is essentially the primary way for ministers to set the direction of travel, during the drafting of the terms of reference, we engage with, quite extensively, we'll engage with, often with affected parties, particularly victims and survivors. We will then settle on what the scope of the inquiry should be. And after that point, it becomes visibly independent of government. But the scope is clearly defined within the terms of reference. And obviously, there will be expectations of the public, of victims, of survivors, of other parties. And so perhaps there's a second element to John Sturrock's question, which is around education. We believe that the scope and the terms of reference will be very clear. And indeed, if a chair felt it wasn't clear, they'd be pretty quick to raise that with me. So in my engagement with chairs, I believe that the terms of reference and the scope that is set is pretty clear. But on the education, we need to be clearer on what the purpose is with the public. The purpose, I think, is very clearly defined in the terms of reference, and most people who are intimately involved in the inquiry know what it is. If there's a challenge with the wider public, then we can always do more to communicate. But ultimately, the bottom line is a thorough, independent review of the facts and often recommendations to avoid this happening again. That's generally the gist of inquiries.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think it's a silver bullet when often it's not. Thomson solicitors, when he gave evidence, talked about inquiries saying they don't always have to be led by judges. I mean, clearly that other countries don't always have them led by judges. And they said basically that bricks and mortar inquiries, for example, Tram's inquiry was led by a judge, but it didn't necessarily have to be. There's an obvious area where a judge doesn't have to be involved. I just wonder what your thoughts on that are. And I would say, of course, that a judge sits for 205 sitting days and deals with 34 trials on average in that time. So if you've got 3 judges sitting on inquiries, as we have now, that's over 100 trials that are being delayed. So again, it's about the opportunity cost. Justice for one individual or one group of individuals through a public inquiry could be at the cost of several hundred other people getting justice in other areas of Scottish life. And again, I don't ever hear anybody say that. I don't ever hear ministers actually say that. I don't think the public are aware of that. I certainly wasn't aware of that before this inquiry started. So I think it's about balance, and I'm not convinced that we're seeing any of that.
Well, I'm happy to confirm on the record that there is no requirement for the proposed chair to be a judge. If the proposed chair is a Scottish judge, we need to consult first with the Lord President, but there is no requirement for the proposed chair to be a judge. And again, trying to speak candidly here whilst being sensitive, often I hear demands for a judge from those that are supportive of an inquiry being established. But there is no requirement for the proposed chair to be a judge.
There's no requirement, but there seems to be considerable pressure for that to be judge. We even heard that from people who gave evidence here from the legal profession, who of course clearly have one would argue, an interest in terms of that. You know, another issue, of course, is transparency about costs of inquiries. So, again, I'll go back to John Sturrock, who said that there's insufficient transparency and scrutiny, in particular around control over timescales and costs. There's no consistency in the way inquiry costs are recorded, making meaningful comparisons very difficult. And I go back to, again, the Sheikh Bayu inquiry. I understand that there was significant compensation paid to members of the family. I don't know if it's in the public domain how much was paid out or who it was paid to, but surely that's something that should be in the public domain, because it's taxpayers' money, which could be...
So one quick point on inquiry, in transparency, and then I'll ask Don to come in. In terms of transparency, that's obviously an iterative process between us as well and the inquiry. I talked about the process of budget setting. So we obviously push hard as well to have comprehensive forecasts and to be informed as quickly as possible if there are any changes to that, so that we can also manage our budgets in light of that. Don.
So I'm not 100% sure, Convener, what you're talking about in terms of compensation paid to the Bayu family. It may be that you're referencing a separate civil case that they took against Police Scotland that is unconnected.
That is not connected to the inquiry. Is it not as a direct result of the inquiry that that's...
No, it's a separate civil case.
Right, OK. Stand corrected if that's the case. From my understanding, it was because of the inquiry that the police decided to... But even if that is the case, it should be in the public domain, should it not be? Is it going to be in the public domain?
Again, in civil cases, there are sometimes agreements between the parties in terms of what is made public.
The police are representing the public. It's public purse. It's not their money. It's our money.
And again, that's for the police to answer for in some senses. But I think it is that civil case that you are referring to, Convener, that's separate from the public inquiry. It's not the public inquiry that's paid out compensation to them.
Okay. Now, in terms of responding to inquiries, one of the issues, of course, is that sometimes inquiries, after many years, come up with a series of recommendations, and then months, if not years, elapse without them being implemented. I know you're smiling there, actually.
Well, I'm also smiling because sometimes they conclude after changes have already been made. Of
course. I mean, sometimes changes are made before inquiries even start. I mean, that's one of the arguments Police Scotland made, that some of the concerns that were raised about, for example, the Emma Caldwell inquiry, they said they'd already implemented before the inquiry. It's even begun, which is one of the reasons they're harumphing about that particular inquiry. But, I mean, if there's an FAI recommendations, they have to be responded to within 8 weeks. So would it be sound if, for example, something similar was introduced for public inquiries, even if not through a legalistic mechanism? It would be good practice if governments of whatever shape and size decided that within 8 weeks they would respond to recommendations. They don't necessarily always have to say, yeah, we'll implement every single recommendation for the inquiry. I'm sure that would be great for those for whom the inquiry has been set up on behalf of, but certainly at least to respond to Parliament within 8 weeks.
So I should also say that there are other ways of doing this. So there can also be an interim report. So that can ensure that early recommendations are given to the Scottish Government as soon as available, without waiting for the final report. And that means that the Scottish Government can prepare a response to concerns that have been identified and can be perceived by affected parties as offering more transparency around progress against timescales. Suppose the most recent inquiry that I have had to respond to is the COVID inquiry, and that came with very clear timescales attached, with an obligation on us to essentially report back to the Chair and also, obviously, as somebody who's accountable to Parliament, to identify the recommendations that we accepted and those that we didn't, and then secondly, to monitor progress of implementing those recommendations. So for the COVID inquiry, because a report is coming out after each module, it means that you're not waiting. I mean, can you imagine waiting for the conclusion of the COVID inquiry, the UK COVID inquiry, and then implementing all the recommendations for all the modules? Thankfully, that's not the approach that they have taken, nor are we taking. And so Module 1 was published, clear recommendations. We responded to the Chair within months. We have a very clear outline of what we are implementing, what we have already implemented, and what is actually a requirement for other parties, in this case for the UK Government, so coordinating on a four-nations basis. And I think that is a good example of how to respond and implement recommendations quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think interim reports, a lot, not all incidentally, but most witnesses did think that was a really progressive state. And I know the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry also has interim reports. Yeah. Actually, I certainly think they're very helpful. Now, just kind of skimmed the surface here, so I'll let colleagues in now to question you in greater depth. All are keen to come in. So first will be Michelle, to follow by Liz.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us in this inquiry, and I welcome your stated interest. I want to ask some more questions about cost, governance and ethics, and if I do refer to specific inquiries, it's because they form the most useful example. I'm very clear about the scope of our inquiry here. You already referenced Section 17 in the UK Inquiries Act of 2005, and particularly in regard to the need to avoid any unnecessary cost of public funds. But what concerns me is there's surely within this Act a fundamental conflict of interest in that the Chair is responsible for controlling the costs and the person who authorises spending. By any measure, the lack of independent oversight and the weak accountability mechanisms, and you yourself have recognised that it's a demand-led budget and the most you can in effect hope for is sight of costs. There's considerable ambiguity to the meaning of unnecessary, and of course it's the Chair's ultimate judgment, and of course the risk of scope creep are also a major concern. So would you agree that the UK Act needs reform, and what are your ideas of resolving this tension between the Chair and accountability of funding? Because it seems to me to be quite critical.
So that line about the Chair being under obligation to avoid unnecessary costs is a very serious one. It's a requirement of the Chair to avoid unnecessary costs. And whilst they will ultimately determine matters like staffing, leases and so on, they do need to consider that need to avoid any unnecessary costs. So when I am engaged in a conversation, which is not one to seek to compromise the independence of an inquiry, it is a point that I can labour the need to avoid any unnecessary costs. We can also provide some very clear steers. We can provide guidance on ways to deliver value for money, such as on agreeing leases, procuring IT and appointing staff. But you're right in saying that ultimately it is for the Chair. So the Chair is bound by that requirement on avoiding any unnecessary costs. And then the decisions that they take are for them. So in responding to your question, I have merely confirmed the facts as they are. And again, I think if there's a recommendation there from the committee, the challenge will be, as soon as we set strict budgets, there is a risk that it is perceived that we are interfering in the independence of an inquiry. So I look forward to seeing how the committee think we should navigate our way through in respecting the independence of the committee whilst at the same time keeping costs manageable.
And that's been very much the line that's been taken by a variety of witnesses. But I would refer back to the convener's comment about how do they manage to do it in other countries. We have precedent where public inquiries are considered, they've got a high degree of trust by the public and they're considered to be authentic, and they also have cost control. So if other countries, such as Sweden, can do it, why can't we do it in Scotland, and why can't we do it in the UK?
And I think we will reflect very carefully on that, and I think there's probably an opportunity with the committee's recommendations to consider very carefully going into the next parliamentary term what changes the committee thinks should be made in line with the approach that other countries take.
Okay.
Because I strongly believe that this needs to be progressed on a cross-party, cross-parliamentary basis.
Okay, thank you for that, and I don't disagree. In the letter you wrote to us on the 30th of May, you reiterated the alternatives to a public inquiry in terms of shorter timescales and at less cost overall than public inquiries. And you say that such considerations would be part of a decision-making process alongside other relevant factors. So given that, can you walk us through the decision-making process as to why the Sheikh Obayu inquiry should continue in its current form? Who made that decision and why? And what assessment, therefore, have you made to cost, given that its cost of public purse is actually 26.2 million in direct costs thus far? So
let me go through this in some detail as carefully as I can, because many of these issues are live. So the Sheikh Obayu public inquiry was set up to get answers for the families of Mr Bayo about his death and to identify lessons and improvements for the future. That inquiry has now run for several years. It was moving towards closing statements and then the focus on drafting the report. So if memory serves me, there's 122 days. There's approximately 120 days worth of evidence. And I think that if the committee care so strongly, as you obviously do, about value for money, it is really important that that evidence is used to inform a report. And restarting a process, whatever that process looks like, I think would be counterproductive if we want this to come to a conclusion in a way that carries the confidence of parties.
And I accept what you're saying, except we're in a kind of slightly circle here in that the concern I personally have is that we could be looking down the barrel of another £26.2 million and associated cost, given that we recognise the role of the chair. Any new chair may then want to say, well, that is how Lord Bracadale chose to do things, this is how I choose to do things. And that surely is the countering concern to what you outline.
So the immediate priority is to appoint a new chair to enable the inquiry to complete its work. My strong, unwavering view is that it is in the public interest for the inquiry to come to a conclusion promptly. And in discussions with the Lord President, who I must consult with, those have been very useful discussions, but there is a shared perspective of bringing the inquiry to a conclusion as promptly as possible, and for the recommendations then to be implemented as swiftly as possible. And I have grave reservations about starting an entirely new process. Whether it's a public inquiry or something else, I think it undermines the principles I've just outlined to bring the inquiry to a conclusion promptly.
And I hear clearly what you're saying, but again, there's a conundrum in here that you're appropriately calling to the higher power, which this is public funds, and therefore seeking to put your view that it would be appropriate that it's brought to a conclusion. But, you know, the government does run the risk, therefore, of accusations of meddling in the independence of the chair. And I cannot see how that circle can be squared with the current legislation and provision.
Well, let's start with what are our legal requirements. So our legal requirement here is that the death of Sheku Bayo needs to be reviewed and investigated. And teams can come in if you want. In 2019, the Justice Secretary set out to Parliament that the Lord Advocate, as head of the system for the investigation of deaths in Scotland, concluded that a fatal accident inquiry into the death of Sheku Bayo would not allow all the issues requiring investigation to be addressed. We then have had several years of examining the issues. So to then go back to 2019 and to essentially dismiss years of evidence would be counterproductive to that original legal requirement under which we operate. So in terms of the options in front of me, I want to see the inquiry conclude promptly. I think that's in everybody's interest for it to conclude promptly. I think it needs to conclude in a way that uses all the evidence that has been given over several years. And the chair who will be appointed will need to consider that evidence, manage closing statements, and draft a report. I can see no other alternative, despite there being some discussion in the public domain about alternatives. When you actually break it down into the facts, the legal obligation under which we must operate in relation to a death like Sheku Bayo's, and the costs of the last 100+ days of evidence, I cannot see how you can come to any other conclusion but to believe that a chair should be appointed who examines the evidence. I see no reason for a chair to have to undertake all 100 days' worth of evidence again. I don't think anybody believes that's required, because those 100+ days are all recorded. Yeah. They are able to be viewed, and it will be for a chair to be appointed. I don't know if anybody wants to come in and correct anything I've said, or
I think you're being very clear, but we're not really comparing apples with apples. I'm not suggesting that there'll be another £26.2 million. What I'm suggesting is that it's the right of the chair, and I don't want to labour this point, to make an assessment of the evidence that has been gathered thus far, and therefore there is at least the possibility that they may wish to further interrogate certain pockets of it. I'm not suggesting the entire thing would be run again. That, as a minimum, is a possibility, and I'm pointing that out, that in terms of cost control and accountability, this conflict of interest at the heart of the 2005 Act is largely unresolvable.
So on that, can I agree with you in full?
Right.
I thought you might have been asking whether a fatal accident inquiry, which has been suggested by some parties, would be a more cost-effective route. So I was laying out why I didn't think that was the case. But you're absolutely right that a new chair will operate within the same guidance as any other chair, which is that they will set the parameters and the Scottish Government will be required to fund that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. continuing, I wanted to talk a little more about the perception of bias. And I think we would all agree that it was certainly unfortunate that Lord Bracadale met with the Sheikh Abai family 5 times in secret, and that led to the threat of legal action with the Chief Constable of Police Scotland, the threat of a judicial review by the Scottish Police Federation, and Lord Bracadale's ultimate resignation. Now, his actions led to the perception of bias, whether or not that was the case. So I personally was surprised, therefore, that the First Minister recently met with the Sheikh Abai family, but not with the police officer Nicole Short, who was punched and stamped in the back of the head. Obviously, from her perspective, a man high in drugs, wielding a knife, leaving her permanently disabled, unable to work again. Now, again, I'm making no comment on the details of the case, but I'd appreciate the Deputy First Minister's thoughts on why this could lead to the perception of bias, whether or not this is the case, and especially on top of the perception of bias with Lord Bracadale.
Thank you. So in terms of this, allows me an opportunity to be really clear. So the request came to the First Minister to meet with the Bio family. He agreed. The request has also come from other parties that you've just mentioned. He's also agreed to meet.
Good. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for that.
And he's not part of the inquiry in terms of... Don, did you want something to say?
Yeah, I mean, you were describing the kind of issues around kind of accusations of bias within the inquiry. I mean, the obvious point to make is that ministers are not part of the inquiry. They are not decision makers on any conclusions that the inquiry may reach. So
correct. But if we're emphasising, again, this is a circular thing, if we're emphasising the independence of the inquiry, therefore it's incumbent upon ministers to be very careful around any perception of bias. So I think that's the point I'm making. In terms of ethics, one of the long-standing Nolan principles underpinning ministerial office is obviously integrity. Ministers should not act or take decisions in order to gain financial or other material benefits for themselves, their family or their friends. So I was pleased to note in March 2024 that the former First Minister Hamza Yusuf declared an interest in his friendship with Amr Anwar, the campaigning lawyer, who obviously has a key role and critical beneficiary interest in the Scottish COVID inquiry. And he put on the record, and I'll do that as well, Hamza Yusuf said, "I have a friendship with Amr Anwar, who's representing Scotland's COVID bereaved in the UK in Scottish inquiries." However, as you point out, Mr Yusuf was Justice Secretary during 2018 to 2021, and the Sheikh Abai inquiry was announced in 2019, with Mr Anwar, the campaigning lawyer, a beneficiary of significant public funds. Mr Yusuf subsequently became First Minister in 2023, and the Emma Caldwell inquiry was announced the same year, with Mr Anwar, the campaigning lawyer, a beneficiary of public funds. So my question is, if there was an ethical requirement to put the friendship on the ministerial record for the COVID inquiry in March 2024, why was there no requirement to do so in 2019 and 2023?
In terms of that question, I think in terms of the requirement to declare an interest, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. So I'm happy to go and explore what the obligation on ministers are, but as you will know, we are required on a regular basis to review our publicly declared register of interest. We do that as an MSP as well as a minister, and the Cabinet Secretariat regularly requires us to update that and to ensure it is as up to date as possible. And that is the obligation that we all sit under, irrespective of what particular issue is on our desk, if that makes sense. So that is a register of interest that should apply irrespective of the specific decision that we're making. And in all of these situations, obviously advice would have been given from officials to ministers. And so ministers don't take decisions independently of officials. There is extensive legal and other policy advice that is given to ministers in all decisions that they take.
Donald, do you want to come on to the record? I saw you were...
Simply the point that the DFM's already made, which is in these cases, you know, I'm thinking of the Sheikh Abai inquiry in particular, you know, very substantive advice was given to ministers covering all the kind of policy and legal considerations that they may need to take into account in reaching that decision. And the DFM's already referred in our previous evidence to some of the key factors then that were involved in that decision. So I just want to make clear that very substantive advice was given to ministers in that case that informed their decisions.
Yeah. And in that respect, I mean, I noted obviously that the latest version of the ministerial code that came in with the current First Minister, in fact. But, of course, this integrity and the need to declare friendships was, of course, already in place well before 2018. And in that respect, I think it would be of interest to the committee to understand what advice was proffered so that we can understand the decision-making at that point. And the reason I'm asking that is that one of the critical issues around this is the independence or not of public inquiries, and we've talked about it quite a lot in terms of cost, but also there is the influence of ministers and government, which is an important part of maintaining trust. So any further information about advice proffered, I'm sure, would be appreciated.
Well, I'd be very happy just to give some further evidence on, some written evidence on the obligations under which ministers sit in terms of their declaration of interest, because it's a very regular part of our obligations, and as I said, I think it is refreshed on an annual basis at least, and if there's any change in circumstances, it requires to be refreshed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. List before by Craig.
Thank you, Convener. Can I first of all put on the record my involvement with the El Jamel inquiry, particularly this week when there are 2 public inquiry sessions, and I've submitted my formal statement to that inquiry. Deputy First Minister, could I ask you about whether the Scottish Government has a view in response to some of the complaints that we have received in evidence that one of the reasons for the increase in the demand for public inquiries is the perception that the Scottish Government or its agencies have failed in their, or allegedly failed in their duty to sort out a problem before it came to a public inquiry?
I think I would disagree with that, because if that were the case, and in some cases we can be very open and honest and say that ministers have not always got it right. Okay, so let's take that as read, that ministers don't always get it right. But if that were the case, then I believe the public would be aware of the alternatives that exist to a public inquiry, and that in some cases might be better suited to the purpose of identifying the facts, and maybe faster. So I had some exchanges with the convener about inquiries lasting 5 to 10 years. And there are a number of alternative options to statutory public inquiry. I think it's a very simple matter that statutory public inquiries are often very dominant in public debate. They're very dominant in the media. There's a lot of interest in them, and it will be a simple issue of the public assuming that the public inquiry is the only route by which they can get a thorough review of the facts. So I think there will always be, if we accept as read, ministers don't always get it right, there are still other alternatives for the public to get a thorough review of the facts that aren't constrained legally in the same way that public inquiries are.
Can I ask, on the same theme, how would you respond to the complaints of the victims of the El Jamel situation who, without going into the details of the case, they are very firm in their view, and I have to say I share that view, that the need for a public inquiry would not have come about had we resolved the issues about Professor El Jamel's malpractice, which was allowed to continue by a health board who quite clearly at the time knew of that malpractice. Would you accept that that's a fair comment?
I think that I completely understand where those who share that view are coming from. The bottom line is that there would not be a need for a public inquiry or indeed for a review if there had not been malpractice. And there's probably a lot of issues underpinning that, which would, to do justice, would take far longer in terms of what health boards did or did not do, which I won't get into now, but not least because it is for the inquiry to explore that.
Yeah, it is for the public inquiry, and I don't think it's right for us to discuss the details of it, but I think there is an issue, and it has been put to us by quite a number of our witnesses, that there is this public perception at the moment, and I think it's tied to the question that the convener asked about public trust, that one of the reasons why public trust has been eroded is because too many people feel that the delivery of public services is not meeting their needs, and more importantly, not meeting the desired expectations. And I just wonder if the government, Scottish Government, has a view on whether that is something that concerns them.
Again, I don't want to dismiss that position, because I want to say again on the record that ministers don't always get it right. The difficulty I have with that position is that many of the inquiries are actually considering very historic issues. So the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, for example, is considering historic issues. Emma Caldwell is considering historic issues. And actually, in terms of the El Jamel inquiry, that might be one of the more recent, less historic examples. But the inquiries that are currently live deal with both very specific individual cases, like Emma Caldwell, as well as more general issues, like the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. And then in between, you have the El Jamel inquiry that obviously is dealing with very personal individuals. So I think the nature of public inquiries is that they are all very different in terms of being case issues as well as individual issues, being historic as well as more modern. And whilst I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of if there had not been mistakes made, then there would not be a need for inquiry. I think that is, I would have no argument with that.
That's helpful, Deputy First Minister. I'm sure further revelations will come forth within the public inquiry. Can I ask you about a technical issue? We have had, obviously, the 2005 Act governs what happens in the Scottish public inquiry. But we've had, within the El Jamel inquiry, a bit of an issue about the terms of reference, because two of the contributing pieces of evidence have to come from HSE and the General Medical Council, both of which are reserved bodies. And that is an issue because of the fact that the 2005 Scottish Act and the UK Act, they don't necessarily collaborate on this kind of thing. And I just wondered if in any review that does take place of public inquiry legislation, do you believe that there is much very important scope for the UK government and the Scottish government to collaborate very effectively over possibilities that the reserved and devolved legislation needs to come together to answer very specific questions and to allow evidence to be taken from another jurisdiction? So,
yes, in short. I will also expand in saying that I am very aware of the frustration that patients feel by the exclusion of HSE and the GMC from the terms of reference, because they are UK bodies and out with the competence of the Scottish Parliament to legislate on and out with the ambit of a Scottish inquiry. The inquiry, of course, is free to call any witness that it sees fit to call, and can therefore seek to recover and consider evidence from both the GMC and the HSE as far as that evidence may inform the discharge of its terms of reference. But in terms of the collaboration, I absolutely agree. And I know it's a totally different issue with, it's obviously it's a UK inquiry, the COVID inquiry, but I think you see evidence there of extremely effective cross-government, cross-nation engagement and evidence giving and gathering. So we would certainly be open to explore again any recommendations from the committee, and any call for evidence in this particular inquiry would be entirely a decision for the inquiry chair. And I am, of course, confident that Lord Weir will deliver a very fair and thorough inquiry.
Yeah, I'm sure he will. Can I just finish on the point as to whether the government might have any intention to review the 2005 legislation, because that is a 20-year period, and it's during that 20-year period where we have seen a very considerable increase in the number of public inquiries and some of the very important issues that we're discussing as this committee.
So there is an openness. I think I want that to come through in my evidence today. There is very much an openness to considering the committee's recommendations and considering what changes could be made. Unlikely to be before Parliament enters recess, but in the next parliamentary term. And my strong desire is to see that done on a cross-party basis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Craig, to be followed by Michael.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Deputy First Minister. In terms of some of the evidence we've taken, there's been a sense that ministers who feel in a tight spot because of pressure from the public will often take the route of a public inquiry because effectively it gets it off their desk and into the long grass. Your experience, obviously, of public inquiries may be different in respect of that. But is there anything that can be done to try and create a threshold so that basically politicians don't simply take what could be perceived to be the easy option, which is to hand it over to a judge and to get it off your desk?
I hope the evidence taken so far today, Craig Hoy, reassures you that I will always remain in a tight spot on all these matters. And there's certainly no view, I believe, from ministers that it, to use your words, gets off our desk, because you will have seen, particularly in the last few months, that there have been some challenges around elements of public inquiries. I believe strongly that it's not just so-called pressure from the public. It is the very, very weighty, substantive issues that are the subject of these inquiries, where victims or survivors or others want to see an independent and thorough review of the facts. And I think that is where a public inquiry comes in, because I work tirelessly to ensure that I give no appearance of compromising the independence of an inquiry, because it is the very independence of the inquiry that often victims and survivors most want to see. So it's not about giving into public pressure. It's often extremely difficult issues that it's clear to see can only be resolved through that independent route.
And one element that apparently, according to some of the evidence we've taken, that gives the public confidence in the inquiry when they are set up is that it is judge-led.
Yeah.
What is your view in relation to that? And do you think perhaps there should be alternative approaches taken in certain inquiry cases?
So, as I said earlier, it does not need to be a judge, and we are certainly open to non-judge-led public inquiries, and indeed would welcome that. We are very conscious, particularly in the engagement with the Lord President, just how extensive the workload is on judges. So there's also the option for a panel approach as well. So there are alternatives. I don't know if my team want to just come in a little bit on that, because I think it's a really, really good question.
I would just sort of explore, there are opportunities open to the chair to take a panel approach, and that opens it up to having different views round the table when the evidence is being considered. and also it can cut through some of the more technical issues. So where a chair may not be embroiled in some of the more technical parts of the evidence that's been given, they may have panel members who could have that technical expertise and go through the evidence, and actually that may help speed up proceedings, because then you don't have the chair having to be, I suppose, immersed in all of that technical detail. They have an expert who they can call upon. Of course, chairs do employ experts who advise them as part of the proceedings in a public inquiry, but the panel approach is more of a collaborative space where there can be that cross-discussion amongst those particular panel members. And interestingly enough, the public inquiries in Scotland that have taken place have not taken, in broad terms, that panel approach. Mm-hmm. So it would be interesting to see in the committee recommendations if that perhaps is an approach that might be taken up more in the future. And obviously in the alternatives to a statutory public inquiry, there are always more panel type approaches in those alternatives taken. So it is an interesting option to explore in the future.
I think by common consent, one of those inquiries that may have benefited from a different approach was the Edinburgh Trams inquiry, where is a judge best placed to start looking at the construction of lifting paving stones to lay tram tracks. Minister, you'll have looked at that inquiry. What do you think went wrong with the Edinburgh Trams inquiry?
Well, I would like to point out that it preceded me by quite some distance, and
it's historic.
We are. We're in terms of the approach that is taken by a chair. I think ultimately the independence does give the chair the responsibility of determining the costs of the witnesses and so on. And so I couldn't possibly comment on matters going wrong at inquiries, but I think it does show, I think, some of the ironies maybe for the public in terms of cost of inquiry versus cost of the matter that went wrong that they are ultimately reviewing.
Right, yeah. Obviously, in relation to the COVID inquiry, there's a Scottish inquiry and a UK inquiry, so there will be some degree of duplication. There's also kind of asymmetrical approaches taken, for example, in relation to grooming gangs at this point in time, where Louise Casey recommended to the UK government that they should conduct an inquiry, the nature of which is still not absolutely certain. But you'll be aware there's a lot of pressure now on the Scottish government to follow suit. So do you believe that the victims of grooming gangs here in Scotland deserve and require an inquiry? And would it be better that the England and Wales inquiry extends its scope into Scotland? And what are you presently doing in terms of consulting on what next steps the Scottish Government might take in respect of this crucial issue?
Well, it is an extremely important issue. Of that, there is no doubt. It is a horrendous issue. And I think your question illustrates perhaps the impact of all the other questions that we have just been I've just been answering. In other words, there could be a call from committee to say that there are too many inquiries, and I guarantee that within seconds of that report launching, there will be calls for additional specific inquiries. Which is why I think we need to hold these matters quite carefully and look at what the impact is of the theory that we're debating on reality. So the Scottish Government, I think, has responded to that. The First Minister has responded particularly. I sponsor the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, and I know just how much survivors have valued that independent, thorough review of matters that took place in the dark, behind closed doors, and bringing that into the light. So I won't give any further views on the grooming inquiry here. Suffice to say that it is a very, very serious matter, and I think that we there are issues. We should not shut the door on public inquiries generally through the evidence today, because they do have an important role to play.
And just on a point of detail, you'll obviously be aware that one of the reasons given for by the government to not support our call for a public inquiry when we asked for it in a recent Justice Bill was that Professor Alexis Jay did not believe it was necessary. Are you aware of any subsequent correspondence between Professor Jay and the Scottish Government in respect to the advice or the interpretation of the advice that she gave?
Well, I feel that's getting very detailed on a non-current inquiry, and I'm very happy, Convener, to give evidence on current public inquiries and also on the legislation that underpins public inquiries.
I mean, to clarify, I mean, the role of this committee is not to make recommendations on the merits otherwise of individual public inquiries, to look at how such inquiries can be delivered much more effectively, efficiently, particularly cost effectively, and whether or not there is, the kind of the reasons for taking forward such inquiries, are consistent, shall we say?
Yeah. And Craig Hoy did ask a question which I didn't answer, which was the question around duplication or potential duplication between the Scottish and UK COVID inquiries. So there is a memorandum of understanding between both inquiries to minimise duplication, and they are both proceeding on quite different bases. I think you could all agree. So we look forward to, obviously, the findings of the Scottish inquiry too.
Just one final question to go back to a point that I think Michelle Thompson was talking around, which is this issue about relationships with and between interested parties. It's often said that Scotland is a village in many respects, and therefore it is difficult to bring together a group where you may not have prior relationships and others. For example, I was at the Herald Awards on Thursday night, as were you, and one of the lawyers referred to was glad-handing with the First Minister, with other politicians. There is a cosy situation in Scotland between decision-makers, including the legal establishment. What consideration perhaps should be given to looking out with Scotland when we're looking to try and bring in those who may chair or be involved with public inquiries at a senior level, for the avoidance of any doubt that there may be interested parties and interrelationships that may compromise the actual inquiry itself?
Well, I would want to put on record that ministers have to operate within very strict parameters, and our decisions and the process that brings us to that decision is obviously heavily scrutinised by Parliament, but obviously heavily informed by neutral civil servants as well. So I think it's really important to state that there is a lot of checks and balances on all decisions that ministers make. In terms of input from outside Scotland, Don may want to say a little bit more because of recent discussions about that. But I do think that there is an obligation on Scotland to resolve the issues that arise in Scotland. And, at the end of the day, our sort of solicitors, advocates, judges are very intimately familiar with Scottish law, which certainly enables them to get to grips with an issue on a much faster basis than others would. But I don't know, Don, if you want anything to add.
So, in terms of the statute, it's absolutely an option for ministers to have a chair from outside Scotland, whether that be a judge or a non-judge. And indeed, I think there is a precedent. Is it the fingerprint inquiry? I think it was a Northern Ireland judge, I think it was. So it has happened in the past in Scottish inquiries. As the DFM alludes to, one of the considerations for ministers is, for example, some of the current ones that deal with the Scottish justice system in one way or another. Actually, does the knowledge of a Scottish judge of evidence and procedure and Scottish justice system actually make it more, practical to have a Scottish judge or a Scottish chair, as opposed to somebody who's more used to procedure and evidence and rules of evidence in a different country.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Michael, to be followed by John.
Convener, can I begin by echoing what Liz Smith said about my own involvement in the LGML inquiry for the record, in a similar way in presenting my own evidence to it. Given the statements you've made today, Deputy First Minister, do you think that the cost of £258.8 million is too high?
Well, I can tell you how I could spend that money in other ways, and I could identify ways in which we could support victims, we could implement recommendations, and we could avoid a lot of the harm that is the subject of some of these inquiries. Having said that, I think one of the hallmarks of open, transparent democracy is that there is a place for independent, thorough review of the facts, importantly, independent of ministers. So in answering the question of how I could otherwise spend that, it all comes back to ministers making decisions. And it's really important that at times there is a mirror that is held up independently of ministers on what has actually happened.
So ministers are making those decisions of when to hold up the mirror in regard to when to bow to the pressure as other members have set out, public pressure where they feel that government haven't given them the answers that they require, or that institutions more broadly in Scottish society haven't given them the answers required. But how would you account for the uptick in recent inquiries? There's been some put by other members regarding whether that's about the government. If it's not about the government's actions, and you said that you didn't believe it was, why is it?
Well, I was very clear that I think that government doesn't get it always right. But I would reject the suggestion that this is just a question of bowing to public pressure. So if you look at all the issues that are currently live inquiries, we didn't set up a Scottish child abuse inquiry because of public pressure. We set it up because it is utterly ghastly what has gone on in this country for decades. You will be more familiar with the LGML inquiry, and I won't comment on what the inquiry will or won't do, but we didn't set it up just because of public pressure. We set it up because victims, survivors, and indeed colleagues, other MSPs, believed that this was the only way of identifying the facts. So I do think it trivialises, and I know that's not your intention, just to suggest it's bound to public pressure. Your question as to why I think that there has been a growth in public inquiries, I think it does come back to a lack of knowledge and confidence in alternatives. So public inquiries do dominate, as I said, the public discourse. And I think there's a sense in which only a public inquiry will suffice. And it's the only thing that the public can have confidence in determining the truth. It's a bit like why there's usually calls for a judge to chair the inquiry rather than an alternative. And again, it comes from a slightly flawed view, in my view, that only a judge can provide the gravity to a situation. So I think there has been a growth in demand. There has been a number of very, very, very high-profile inquiries. Yeah. And we know what happened last week with the COVID inquiry being an obvious one.
But these are government decisions in the end. So as much as we can talk, and you're right to highlight the very legitimate concerns of people externally making the case, but it's the government in the end that decides to have an inquiry, not to use the alternatives. So it's really not about ignorance on the part of the public. It's actually a decision that's been taken by government, and they appoint the person who leads the inquiry. So these are government decisions, aren't they?
Well, let's take a few layers of that. So firstly, there are other processes, and I'll maybe ask one of the team to come in a moment. There are alternative processes which we employ very regularly, right? So there's no doubt that there's a number of other, fatal accident inquiry being an obvious one, but there are other ones, and perhaps the team can give some detail on that. Secondly, it is important for us to ensure that particularly survivors and victims have confidence in the process. So you can well understand that if a survivor or a victim is saying that they will not have confidence unless X, Y, Z is delivered, and I know that because, with all due respect, there are MSPs around this table that have communicated that directly to me, then government wants to ensure that there's confidence in the process. You know, we don't want to go out of our way to undermine that confidence. So, yes, it's our decision, but our decision is made in good faith in terms of protecting the confidence of a victim or a survivor. The third thing is, it is this government decision, and if I look at the inquiries, I think we'd all be hard-pressed around this table to suggest that there are any of those issues that do not merit a thorough review of the facts, because all of the issues that are being considered by public inquiries are of the most weighty, awful characteristic. So I have a lot of engagement with the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, and it weighs very, very heavily on me. And I am more than, pleased to say that the Scottish Government is proud of having sponsored that inquiry.
So John Sturrock, KC, said to us that the conduct of public inquiries and the possibility that costs are out of control is another example of a more fundamental problem in Scotland, namely that our approach to decision-making, complex issues, negotiation and addressing tough issues is suboptimal. Would you care to reflect on that assessment of the government's approach?
I disagree, because I've just had a exchange with Liz Smith, which I actually think gives the evidence in response to that. That suggests that all the issues that are the subject of public inquiries right now are modern, as of the last few years. So you look at the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, and the reason I keep picking up on that is because we all understand and accept it is the most expensive and the longest running, okay? So that is historic. And I know from speaking to survivors just how much they value the light being shone on horrendous injustice when they were children. So I think that point would hold more water and more weight if the subject of the public inquiries were more modern, and if we were essentially outsourcing the answers to difficult questions. But actually, if you look at the most expensive and the longest running of these inquiries, I don't think that characterisation applies.
Okay, it's a reasonable argument. On the basis of then some of this issue about long grassing issues, taking that a step further, you've said, for instance, today you don't think it would be appropriate to get into the details of the LGML inquiry, but you're not the sponsor of that inquiry. Is there not the risk that these inquiries shut down the ability of government to deal with some of the substantive issues? And I would draw, in terms of the conduct of the government, for instance, the First Minister saying recently on the record, I cannot comment on civil court cases, which is simply untrue. It's completely untrue. There's has to be a sense that the government has candour and ability to actually talk about issues of interest to the public rather than put it into a semi-private domain.
So I think, can I just separate civil cases from public inquiries just for a moment, because I think there's a slightly different answer on the cases. So I think there's an extent to which you are right that if, for example, a report is written so many years after a public inquiry has started, then it does mean that ministers are waiting much longer for the recommendations that are meant to come from this thorough review of the facts. I think that's very different if you look at inquiries where there is a regular output of recommendations. So the example I would give is COVID inquiry. So we are 5 years in from the start of COVID. We've had 2 reports. The government has already began to implement and has an obligation to implement the recommendations from the first report. So that's moving actually at some pace in terms of a direct response to the committee, the inquiry's recommendations. That's very different if you have an inquiry that runs for several years without any interim reports and where it takes quite significantly longer for the recommendations to be forthcoming. But I can comment on any inquiry. I don't want to undermine the evidence that the inquiry is taking, but I'm very happy to comment on the inquiry. Dawn seemed to want to come in, so if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think there's also evidence of public authorities listening carefully to the evidence of public inquiries as they go along and changing their practice and addressing some of the issues as they arise. I mean, the one that springs to mind, again, going back to Sheikh inquiry again, the previous Chief Constable did declare Police Scotland as institutionally racist, a couple of years ago. And discriminatory, and I think that was in very large part because of some of the evidence that was heard and that came out in the inquiry, and some of the procedures that then the Chief Constable put in place to consider those issues through an independent group. So I think there's also evidence that as inquiries go along, the evidence heard actually influences the policy and practice of public authorities as well.
Thank you. And I suppose the issue I'm interested in here is about sponsorship, because whether a minister is a sponsor for a particular issue or a particular inquiry, then if we're reflecting as a committee as to how useful some of this is, would it not be better, do you think, that Parliament sponsored an inquiry and had a central committee that then took decisions about monitoring the activity of that inquiry rather than ministers?
I think it is a very interesting suggestion. And there are some examples of accountability rather, lying with Parliament. I guess you'd have to think through the challenges. So you'd have to think through the obligations around funding. So with some of the bodies that are currently accountable to Parliament, there's an obligation to top slice Scottish Government budgets. And so there would have to be some process of accountability for costs, because otherwise, as it is, I'm able to challenge some figures because I know that it'll be coming out of my budget. But if there's a difference between the body to which there is accountability and the body which covers the costs, I think there's some risks there, but I don't think that these risks can be considered and managed. I think too, the Parliament would have to be really careful about how it manages public pressure because of the reasons that we've just outlined. Whereas with officials heavily informing the process, there is a degree to which officials are one step removed from the public pressure in a way that politicians are not.
Okay. On your point about pace, 5 years on from the COVID inquiry, 2 interim modules produced, you can't really be satisfied with the pace of response for trying to learn lessons about a global pandemic, which we might have another one in a month's time. I mean, surely the convener set out the fact that the inquiry in Australia was completed within, I think, 2 years with full recommendations. This is something that could happen again, and we've already heard, lives were lost, 23,000 lives by the suboptimal, at least, response from the government. Surely that's something that should happen an awful lot quicker, that we can learn lessons quickly, and the system that we're using is not meeting the public need.
I think on the COVID inquiry, did it start in 2022, I think? Was it 2022, 2023? So I suppose it's probably unfair to say it's 5 years on. But those are your words. Indeed, absolutely.
And this is my point. From what happened and something that might happen again next month. So actually, it's how quickly can we get the answers and the lessons that are required? Yeah,
and of course, the time between issue and inquiry is much longer for most of the other inquiries as well. But I think it's a point that stands.
Okay. On the, would you think that there'd be a case for a central office with central experience and standard operating procedures to actually provide the Secretariat backroom capability for each inquiry to bear down on costs?
Yeah, so we have through the approach we've taken to sponsorship, for example, the same team sponsoring now several inquiries have tried to take that approach. So in the spirit of your question, I think there's merit in the same team taking that approach. The only caveat I would make is that, again, the public inquiry subject matter is very, very varied. So, you know, where you have a sponsorship team, okay, they may be intimately familiar with establishing an inquiry and the rules and regulations within which an inquiry operates. But it's very different from the team that, for example, works in the justice space to be sponsoring that inquiry. And then you have a COVID inquiry, which is very health specific. So, you know, I think being too prescriptive, it maybe undermines elements of this. But the sentiment of what you're saying in terms of one team that understands it, I think is well made.
You shouldn't have two different judges across a period of years learning how to book rooms and what IT systems to put in, should you?
Oh yeah, and
that's
there's a lot of support for that. A lot of support. I mean, I spend more time looking at leases for public inquiries these days than other things, because they're being extended. So, I do understand that.
I think. Finally, then, on the we've heard that we think that there should be, if there's bricks and mortar inquiries that are described, and you've given some indication around this, but you don't think it certainly doesn't have to be a judge, but the people the Scottish Government appoint are judges. At what point is the Scottish Government going to say, when these things come forward, actually, a specialist in this area, or somebody with specific or generalist knowledge, is more appropriate to dealing with this issue than a judge?
Well, the
proof will be whether the government does it.
Yeah, and then hopefully Labour and the Conservatives back me in doing it as well, and we ensure that there's confidence across the board. But Marion, do you want to just talk about the process for identifying who can be a chair?
Yeah, so when we consider the advice to ministers in relation to setting up a public inquiry and the terms of reference and the most suitable skill set we would want in a chair, we consider all the options of a non-statutory public inquiry as well. And there's some good examples, actually, where there have been what I would call independent reviews with a public hearing element. So it's almost like a statutory public inquiry because there are public hearings, but it isn't a statutory inquiry. And we have set them up in the past using a QC or a judge, but we also have explored during that process whether there were other people who could fulfil those particular positions. So, for instance, if you go back to the review into the impact of the policing in communities during the miners' strike, it was conducted by John Scott, who was a QC. So, you know, we do look at different alternatives when each opportunity presents itself to consider whether a public inquiry should be held or not. I suppose in terms of the pool of candidates, we mentioned earlier, the person doesn't need to be someone from the Scottish pool of candidates, but there are, you know, I suppose things to consider that we mentioned earlier, because a public inquiry in Scotland, for instance, considers Scottish matters. So you would want someone who could understand what those Scottish matters might be.
So I hear a lot of both this useful context to it, but also your points, Minister, about, you know, it doesn't need to be, we could do, but then you don't. And there is, you come to the same position, which is going to be a judge-led public inquiry. And then, and your point there about you don't want criticism from that, you don't want criticism from the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, from other people. Is that not a weakness in your own confidence in your own arguments as to why you might take this approach, that you're worried about what, you know, myself or Liz Smith or Craig Hoy or somebody else might say, than rather saying this is the right thing to get the job done, to come to the right answers, and right through this is a question of leadership?
So if I didn't want criticism, I wouldn't be doing this job for about 10 years. So that's one very obvious point. Secondly, I enormously value Michael Mara's point here. And I will probably print it out and put it on my door for every time I go into the chamber, because you're absolutely right that leadership in the face of everybody else asking you to do something else is important. Now, I am not committing, you will be delighted to know, to another inquiry at this table today. However, if and when that does happen, because let's be honest, it's likely to happen at some point in the next few years or the next few decades, I would think there is an opportunity to do things slightly differently, and we're certainly up for working with Parliament in that vein.
Could I have one last, very brief? Thank you, Convener. I appreciate it. On the point of that when you're making those considerations,
yeah.
Obviously a lot of media coverage around the Sheikh Ubayu inquiry. This is something that happened in Kirkcaldy one afternoon, affecting directly around about 20 people. Incredibly serious and worthy of investigation, of course. And then the COVID inquiry of huge scope, affecting the entirety of the country. But we've got this kind of one-size-fits-all. Surely the problems in the Sheikh Ubayu inquiry, will that be a point of reflection that the Cabinet will discuss after its conclusion to say, why is this system working or not working? Because this clearly hasn't worked, and we could talk in an awful lot of different ways, and the ways that it's collapsed, the problems that it has, set aside the case for it. But will it be something that you discuss as a government to try and reflect?
So can I first acknowledge just how the job that Lord Bracadale did? Because it is extremely difficult when you have core participants that all fundamentally disagree with one another. And the fact that he was able to manage that over the last few years, I think, was commendable, whatever else has happened in the last few months. I think your point around one-size-fitting-all is really interesting, because there are alternatives in terms of fatal accident inquiry. So there are alternative vehicles available to explore these issues. The Sheikh Ubayu case is different, actually, to the other cases that you identified, because there are very few cases that we are legally obliged to review, and that is one of them. So the question over how to do it is a different one to whether we should have reviewed it, because we are under legal obligation to review it. With the COVID inquiry, I think that there was, as you will know, widespread appetite to explore that, but they are very different. And that is why a chair, it does come back to the original questions, the extent to which a chair is independent to essentially design a process around the core issue. So for some, let's take COVID inquiry, the responsibility there to listen to a very, very broad range of witnesses does not necessarily apply to the Sheikh Ubayu inquiry, where it's much, much tighter. But that will then inform and influence the costs of the inquiry. I know that with the child abuse inquiry, they have been doing an investigation into, for example, specialist schools, including deaf schools. So that requires a major focus on BSL interpreters and so on. So there will inevitably be some variation, and you can either do that by Parliament being super prescriptive and requiring each issue to fit into a mould, or you can do it by giving responsibility to the independent chair. And I think that is something that committee is going to have to wrestle with and weigh up, because I certainly don't think, I think politicians' instinct is always to try and micromanage a problem out of existence. And actually on these matters, there is a reason why chairs are independent of ministers to do what they believe is appropriate for their inquiry.
I think the point is, though, that the Sheikh Ubayu one, as Michael pointed out, it covers only a small number of people in one town at a certain instant, whereas COVID covers a lot of people, whole Scotland. But the Scottish COVID inquiry is still, so far, less expensive than the Sheikh Ubayu inquiry. I think that's an important point to be made in terms of the purpose of the work that we're actually doing as a committee. John?
Thanks very much, Convener. We've covered a bit of ground already, so I shall perhaps build on some of that. The idea of having more of a fixed cost and a fixed time scale at the beginning of an inquiry, which does seem to happen elsewhere in other countries, and thinking, I understand you and I have a similar accountancy background, audits are carried out by independent organisations, accountancy firms usually, Audit Scotland and so on, and they have to be in quite a tight timescale. But, I mean, most people would say they are independent, whoever's carrying them out. Why is there such a fundamental difference that we can audit complicated organisations like banks within a few weeks, and we have to take the legal profession has to take so long to carry out these inquiries?
Well, this is too serious a matter to make a comment about lawyers and accountants, but you can make it for me. I think in terms of these issues, I think they are very different. I think that when it comes to a public inquiry, which I think is what I understood to be your question in terms of the review of the issue, if it was a simple question about figures, I think that would be a lot easier to do. But these are often about a thorough review of the facts in extremely difficult circumstances. Nothing comes to a public inquiry unless it is extremely complex and extremely difficult, where there's probably a degree of breakdown in relationships and a breakdown in trust, to an extent. And so I think these are far more challenging issues. And we do, as I said, I think earlier, part of the demand for a public inquiry is precisely because of its independence, and so therefore the chair is independent. I hope that the convener doesn't mind me saying, but just in terms of the convener's comments, so the total cost from the inquiry website for Sheikh Ubayo is £26.2 million.
Both sides of the actual
and for Scottish COVID inquiry is 45.5 million.
It's 51 million if you include both sides. The total cost is 51 million. Because there's two sides to this.
But have you taken into account the wider cost for the Scottish COVID inquiry as well?
Well,
if you're comparing apples and apples, I just think the point around the Scottish COVID inquiry costing less than Sheikh Ubayo is in terms of the figures. I thought it was important to put the figures on the record.
The figures I've seen over £51 million and rising. I have to say, and even if it was 10 million for that Sheikh Ubayo inquiry, it would still seem an awful lot of money to me for one specific incident compared to the complexity of COVID. Although, even if we look at that, the Swedish COVID inquiry cost less than 2 million. It took only a few months, and I think the people of Sweden appear to be content with actually. They were certainly more content with how the COVID was handled. Certainly would seem to be content with their inquiry, which concluded 4 years ago.
And obviously, all important points, but I just think in terms of the figures, that was important to put on the record.
Right, back to me. So I do accept that auditing a bank and investigating a death or something are different issues. But I just wonder if we could not learn a little bit. I mean, almost every other career, job, profession, whatever you want to call it, is time limited. And cleaners would like to spend longer cleaning things, but they have to do it within a certain time. Auditors have this concept of materiality. So, yes, they might find that somebody has stolen £100 from the Royal Bank of Scotland, but in the scheme of things, that is not material, and they will put that aside when they come to the conclusion that it's a true and fair view or not. So I just wonder, we just seem to be going to the other extreme with some of these inquiries, that whether they go into just too much detail and lose sight of the bigger picture and what's material. Do you not think there's some lessons can be learned from other professions?
So I certainly think that there's lessons to be learned. So if I accept that point, which is why I do believe that there needs to be action going forward, and we take into account the committee's recommendations, because maintaining public consent for inquiries really matters. So if you see a breakdown in public consent for inquiries, then you've undermined the very purpose of an independent, thorough review of the facts. There's 5 public inquiries ongoing in Scotland, as you will know. So there's child abuse inquiry, hospitals inquiry, Sheikh Ubayo, COVID-19, El Jamel inquiry, and then obviously the proposed Caldwell inquiry. And all of those inquiries are obviously, it's for the chair to determine, but the terms of reference are all quite clear for those inquiries. You will appreciate that a few months ago a request was made to me to extend the terms of reference for one of those. I have a duty to consider such a request. I engaged in an exercise to ascertain the views of core participants, and then I came to a conclusion that I would not extend the terms of reference. The point being, you can't just add to the terms of reference. There's a very set legal process to extend the terms of reference.
Okay. I mean, I've suggested this to one of the judges or people who were here before. I mean, could we not go for the model that, you know, you say to the chair, you've got 2 years, you've got £10 million, do the very best you can within that?
I think that there's certainly scope to have those conversations, and Dawn, I'm always sensing now when Dawn wants to come in, so Dawn might want to come in on that. But the risk here is, and I'm assuming that this is in the public domain, but there's an example where one inquiry was given a fairly clear indication of timescales, and then very quickly discovered, as they uncovered the evidence, that this was a much more widespread issue than they had ever assumed. And therefore, the scale of the inquiry significantly increased, with people looking to add on additional modules to the work that they were doing, because I think we were identifying a much greater scale of something that we previously assumed. Dawn, do you want to come in on any of that? Or maybe I've read you wrong.
Yeah, I mean, the only additional point I would make is that some of the people who call for a public inquiry are starting from a place of feeling a strong sense of injustice, or that they've not been told the full truth. And therefore, that kind of opening of the books, that kind of exposing of the detail and, you know, all the, you know, trying to get in the open everything we know about what happened here, and why did things happen, and why were decisions made the way they were, that can be a very strong driver for the people who are campaigning for a public inquiry. And so it's one of the reasons that the chair has such a difficult job, is to decide where's the line in terms of asking for the scale of information from public authorities and others in terms of what happened here. So that is one of the most difficult things, I think, about running a public inquiry, is how far do you need to go as a public inquiry to satisfy that kind of sense of injustice and that need to try and get all the detail of what happened.
Okay, well, that brings me on to another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is how satisfied do you think victims and families are with public inquiries, obviously ones that have concluded? Because I get the impression, and perhaps especially from down south, because it's bigger, there's more of them, that, you know, at the end of the inquiry, you get the report and the family standing outside the court or wherever it happens to be, saying how dissatisfied they are with it all. Because in some cases, people are just looking for, I think they're looking for revenge, they're looking for heads to roll, and they will not be satisfied if they get anything less.
So I think it's a very, very insightful question. Because, and obviously, the answer of the level of satisfaction is ultimately for the survivors or the victims themselves to answer. But I think this goes back to a question that somebody else asked me, and I can't recall if it was Liz Smith or Michael Mara, about whether the increase in public inquiries has come about because basically people are unsatisfied with what is happening. And Dawn's talked about injustice and so on. And I think it is about expectations, that a public inquiry, there's a lot of talk about sort of righting the wrongs of the past. A public inquiry can shine a light on what happened, but it can't undo the past or restore somebody. And I'm very conscious of that with the public inquiries that I sponsor, that yes, there will be a duty to propose recommendations, and yes, there will be a duty on government to respond to those recommendations. But in responding to the COVID inquiry, for example, we want to ensure that we are far better able to respond quickly and far better prepared for the next civil contingency, civil emergency, that may or may not be a health pandemic, than we were in 2020. That does not bring 23,000 people back. And so I think I engaged extensively with COVID bereaved, and there is still grief, and the COVID inquiry cannot take away grief, ultimately. So, and I say that very sensitively because it's important that a survivor responds to that question and not me. But I think that we have to be really clear about what the purpose of an inquiry is, a public inquiry is, and it's to shine a light, but it can't undo the past.
Okay, well, that takes me on to something else then, because are they always shining a light? I mean, COVID, we all lived through not so long ago. I was in the COVID committee for quite some time in Parliament. We had repeated statements from the First Minister. We had debates in Parliament, or questions at least, on a very regular basis. Now, it's all very well for a judge or whoever to look back and say, oh, well, you could have done something differently. But at the time, we were going through a big crisis. None of us had been through it before. If we'd put money aside to prepare for it, that would have been less money for the NHS. So there's a cost to preparing for things. You know, is the COVID inquiry really adding anything material that we didn't know?
Well, I feel that that question is a very difficult one to answer, because there was widespread consensus on the value of an independent review. I often wonder what a public inquiry into other national traumas for the last century would have looked like. But there was a commitment by both governments to be open and transparent and to accept an independent review into their work. As somebody who has now supplied the COVID inquiry with several written statements and will be giving evidence for the second time shortly, you know, I am certainly making myself open and available for questioning by the COVID inquiry. And based on my conversations with, for example, the COVID bereaved, they're very clear that they value that ability to retrospectively ask questions, to try and understand what happened in greater detail, but ultimately to try and avoid it happening again. As someone who made decisions during that time, I know that if I'd had hindsight, it would have been a much easier job.
Okay. We could probably go further on that, but I'll leave that just now. Kind of going back a bit to the costs of the inquiry, you know, it's been suggested that inquiries should be inquisitorial rather than adversarial. And yet, I just wonder if we've got the balance right, because some of the evidence we've had, you know, there just seems to be lawyers absolutely everywhere. There's lawyers for the victims, there's lawyers for the government, there's lawyers for the health board, there's lawyers for the police. Lawyers. And I know there's been some kind of mitigation, or, you know, at least 2 or 3 groups can have the same lawyer, so that saves a little bit of money. But I do wonder if the whole thing has become just too legally driven. And again, there's the fact you've been asked at length about judges as chairs, but, you know, in a sense, a judge as a chair will encourage that because that's what they're used to.
I think it's a fair question. I mean, ultimately, if you need to understand the breakdown of costs for an inquiry and where the costs are going. Obviously, it's a weighty process, which is why it gives confidence to victims and survivors and others that facts will be made known and the truth will be uncovered. And therefore, in light of that weightiness, there are advocates and solicitors involved. So it's very difficult for me to say otherwise, unless anybody else wants to comment on that.
I mean, my understanding of public inquiry procedure is that it should be an inquisitorial procedure. I mean, I think that is the philosophy of public inquiries, is that it should be inquisitorial. That's my understanding.
I would just add that the Inquiries Act is really clear. A public inquiry is not a civil or a criminal court, and they have no power to determine civil or criminal liability, and they must report in terms of the facts and the evidence that they hear. So, you know, in terms of the proceedings, it's not, a public inquiry is not a court of law. It is not hearing evidence in the same way. And when a chair is appointed, they're very clear on what their role and responsibility is from the onset, and they will go where the evidence leads them. So I suppose in terms of the inquisitorial versus adversarial, I think the strong chairs have brought control over some of those legal adversarial type confrontations. That you can see that play out in some of the public inquiries that have been televised, and you can see the hearings play out. The chair will intervene if they feel that they are that the proceedings are not proceeding along the lines of a public inquiry, and they will bring it back into the realms of a public inquiry.
Okay, I mean, I totally agree that that is the aim and where we should be. I just am concerned a bit that we have strayed away, in some inquiries at least, and it's become much more, and the public see it much more as a kind of court of law, and we've got one side arguing their case and one the other. On another point, the whole thing about recommendations, you've explained a little bit about how recommendations from inquiry are put into place. Do you think we need more of a structure for that? I mean, should there be a Parliament committee that would perhaps look at that, or subject committees could look at different ones, or does there need to be more of a process in that?
There could be. I think, again, it'll be a different approach for different inquiries, which I appreciate the committee, it probably doesn't satisfy the committee, but I think that there will be some recommendations that are for government primarily, and the Parliament can already scrutinise whether or not government has implemented that recommendation. There will often be recommendations for other bodies as well, other public bodies, which are again accountable to the Parliament. And so in terms of scrutiny of the implementation of recommendations, I think whatever format or structure that Parliament wishes to see could be developed. I think that's perfectly feasible to do. And you already see some of that, in terms of ministers having to give an account for recommendations that have been implemented in terms of Module 1 for the COVID inquiry. But I think there will be some recommendations too, which are for all of us as a society through some of the recommendations too, which is harder to pin on one particular organisation or body.
Okay. On something completely different, on the 2005 Act's been mentioned a few times. Have we got complete freedom to change that or introduce a new law, or are we in any way bound by the 2005 Act?
So the 2005 Act is a reserved UK Act. So revisiting that would require UK to decide to revisit the primary legislation. However, we do have the ability for Scottish matters that ministers are overseeing in public inquiries to set rules around that, and we do have a set of Scottish rules. We're restricted in what we can do. We can only do that around what would be Scottish matters, but we're also in parallel working closely with our UK colleagues, because they are, in light of the House of Lords report, reviewing public inquiries going forward. So if there is an opportunity that UK would revisit the 2005 Act, for instance, we would work closely with them and feed into that. We could also do our own independent primary legislation if that were thought to be the best route for us in Scotland separately.
Independent legislation that would change the 2005 Act, even though it's reserved?
So I'll hand over to Emma.
We could make legislation insofar as it relates to Scottish matters. So we could make our own legislation in respect of public inquiries that were into wholly Scottish matters.
Okay, right. Okay, I think leave it to that. Thanks, Camino.
Okay, thank you very much. That's concluded questions from colleagues. I've got one or two just to finish off with. One thing which we've not touched on is consultants. When we were initially provided by the Scottish Parliament Information Centre with details of the costs of public inquiries over the last decade, we were advised that 10% of the costs were spent on consultants, but even inquiring for numerous witnesses and Spice themselves were unable to find out what that 10% is on. So I'm just wondering if you can, Donald's shaking his head, I'm just wondering if he's got some information on what that is all about.
If I'm honest, I'm surprised by that number. It's not a number I recognise. I do know, obviously inquiries, a significant part of their cost is for counsel who are fee paid, but who I would not describe as consultants. Inquiries often have experts, some have panel members or assessors, again, who I would not classify as consultants. So it's very unclear to me what that number relates to. My suspicion is that some of these categories of assessors or expert witnesses and so on who are paid to prepare reports for committees have been somehow categorised as consultants, but I certainly, as somebody who sponsors 3 public inquiries, I certainly don't recognise that number of 10% of costs.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm asking it is because it's obviously very significant in terms of our £258.8 million budget, and it's been a bit frustrating trying to find out exactly the detail of that over the last 6 months. I mean, one of the other issues, of course, that we have is the fact that we talked about judges. I mean, we heard you say, for example, sense of injustice, shining a light, etc., etc. But we also have to remember that in shining this light and dealing with sense of injustice, as I mentioned earlier, if we've got judge-led inquiries and they're not dealing with ordinary trials, these people who are probably being denied or delayed justice, and I think that's an issue that's not being considered adequately from what I can see. And if the Scottish Government continues to appoint judges, even if they say, oh, that is not necessarily the route that always has to be gone down, surely that's just a reinforcement of the view that's conveyed to the public and the media and others that only a judge inquiry is valid. So it's actually reinforcing a situation which is more expensive and more time-consuming.
And I think there's certainly inquiries that have benefited from being judge-led. So having said that there's alternatives, there's obviously some that have benefited from that. I have no current plans to establish another inquiry.
A very tentative response there.
Despite calls already this morning for another inquiry, Mr. Craig Hoy. We'll take all of that into account. It is worth just pointing out there is, of course, 5 live inquiries, 1 proposed. And I just say that because sometimes when we're talking, you start to assume we're talking about hundreds here. And there's 5 plus 1. And looking at the subject matters of all of them, they're extremely challenging, complex,
and
difficult issues.
And as I pointed out earlier on, and John also mentioned, there's significantly more in the UK, which over the same time period has spent about £1.5 billion. But I think the terms of reference we've not really touched on either so much. So, for example, I think they have to be very clear and robust in setting terms of reference. So if you look at both Piper Alpha and Dunblane shooting inquiries, these were really very traumatic incidents for all those who lived through and remember the detail of that. I think it was 167 men died in Piper Alpha and 16 children, a teacher in Dunblane. And yet these were very short, succinct, straightforward inquiries that cost a fraction of the inquiries we were talking about. I think Lord Cullen's inquiry at Piper Alpha was under £2 million to just over a year. But what we have is, as Professor Cameron stated in evidence, and I quote, has to be recognised that inquiries are a source of substantial income for some large legal firms, and as such the question arises as to the extent to which they are motivated to keep costs to a minimum within budget. So what we've seen is a kind of almost explosion of legal costs. Do you think that the fact that some legal firms have people going on television actually demanding the extension of inquiries or the establishment of inquiries when they themselves have a direct pecuniary interest to be inappropriate?
Well, the terms of reference is the primary area where a minister can set the direction of the public inquiry. And once they've established the public inquiry and set the terms of reference, it's then the chair alone which is responsible for deciding how an inquiry should operate. So the importance of the terms of reference cannot be overstated. So on that, I agree with you. I mentioned earlier that I have had some very recent experience of a request to extend the terms of reference. The process that I went through and then my ultimate decision not to extend the terms of reference. I will not exhaust the reasons here, but I think I would encourage the committee to look at our recent example and take some confidence from the process that we undertook and our decision, despite there being very conflicting views in the public domain as to whether we should or shouldn't extend the terms of reference. We followed our process, and I'm confident in the decision that we came to.
Okay, and what about lawyers going on television to demand an extension?
I think that is outside my remit. I have to make decisions on the basis of the evidence before me, and the basis of the advice that my officials give me, and on the basis of engagement. And that, to be perfectly frank, is what influences my decisions, and nothing beyond that.
Okay, now the evidence we've had from Dr Ayrton, who specialises in this area, says there's been remarkable evidence-based work commissioned on what inquiries cost, how they manage those costs, and how spending compares against original budgets. They're often concluded with a minimal formal evaluation of system-wide learning. So is that something the Scottish Government is going to alter as we move forward?
I think that's probably what you're doing right now, isn't it?
Well, we'll be making recommendations in a report, but it'll be up to the government to act on that. And as we talked about with public inquiries, with interim reports making changes as we go on, I would hope that the government, seeing where we're coming from, will already be looking to make some changes.
Absolutely. I really hoped that in answering your questions today, I would give a very strong sense of my appetite to read your recommendations and to take action as a result. And I have tried quite hard not to be too defensive. Whether that's worked or not is for you to determine, but not to be too defensive as though we are set in the ways that we've always done it, because I think that there is certainly room for us to learn from the committee's review here.
I don't think you've been defensive. All I have to say, to be honest, you've been answering the questions fairly directly, which is always very welcome. I mean, one thing that John Sturrock KC said was, and it goes along with what I've been saying earlier, and John Mason and others, is that there's always tensions between time, cost, quality, justice and outcomes. But Michelle Thompson sent me a comment, actually, so I'll give her the credit for it rather than try and claim it for myself. But she says, it's worth mentioning there are no other public sector projects running without project management and cost control, so why should this be different? And also, sponsorship teams are encouraged to familiarise themselves with lessons learned, reports from previous inquiries and the statutory framework, but do they do so?
So all of that is done by the Chair, and there's probably little value in me responding to that question as the sponsor.
You're the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, surely you'll be someone who'll be giving leadership.
But the responsibility for managing the costs as per the Inquiries Act is on the Chair. And I go back to just expressing my understanding of the purpose of the question, because I'm in the midst of setting budgets, and I can think of lots of things that I would like to attribute funding to and assign funding to, but I also have to make sure that there's a buffer for the demand-led public inquiries.
But the Scottish Government select a chair. So surely, if you're looking for a chair, you're looking for someone who's actually going to take real cognizance of the impact. Who's just going to live in some kind of bubble for the next 5 or 10 years.
And I think the one thing I would absolutely reassure the committee is that our chairs are all very conscious of their obligation in that regard. And I can vouch for that because it is the subject of conversations that I have with them. And I engage periodically with the chairs of the inquiries that I sponsor. And I'm very grateful for the sacrifice that some of these chairs make in managing these public inquiries, and I think it is worth.
They do it out of the goodness of their heart. They don't get paid vast amounts of money. Then no.
But I think you do a disservice to them if you don't recognise what some of the costs are to them as well. And for some of them, in particular, the added dimension of public scrutiny that comes with an inquiry is, I think, it is challenging. I think it speaks to the challenges that we have right across the public sector these days in recruiting good people. Because of the difficulties inherent with a very, very visible role like that.
Okay, Michelle wants to make a final point.
Right. It was just to pick up on the point. I don't disagree with anything that you've said, Deputy First Minister, in this respect, but I would simply make the point that how can it be possible that we credit judges who are incredibly learned in their field with the type of programme management skills and experience? That doesn't seem to be fair to them. And you made an earlier comment, and it straight jumped into my head, yeah, but that's an issue of change control, because I've been a programme manager, and there is no other walk of life where we set someone loose with an unlimited budget without the support, and we don't even have the processes yet where we have a fixed project management office that can assist and guide these things. And that actually is ultimately quite unfair to judges when you look at their skill set, and it's inconceivable. It doesn't happen in any other type of project, and it just seems ridiculous.
The chairs are very well supported by secretariats. So chairs are extremely... So when I engage with the chair, I am engaging with the chair and the secretariat, and I think probably chair and chief executive is not particularly accurate. But there is a very important role for secretariats. The chair, you're absolutely right, is largely in the chair, convening and managing, but they are extremely well supported by their secretariat. And the relationship between the secretariat and the sponsor team is extremely strong. So that's probably the strongest link, unless Don tells me otherwise, strongest link between government and the public inquiry.
And that's all good, but the power resides ultimately with the chair who signs off on the budget. And that kind of brings me back full circle to my opening remarks. And that's where the critical issue is. The chair is not accountable to anybody. The secretariat that you outline is accountable to the chair, and I'm assuming accountable to government. But that's where the critical issue is.
I think it's useful to hear members' thoughts on that. I think too, if you look at the chairs that we have, many of them have come to the sort of conclusion of it's towards the end of their careers, for example, and they don't actually have to do this. So I do commend our chairs for taking up the mantle in chairing some very, very difficult, thorny issues. And I think that in the inquiry's findings and recommendations, which I look forward to reading, if I could be so bold, as to caution against any suggestions of ulterior motives of chairs, because the important thing is that we are able to, when a very important issue presents itself and requires a public inquiry, that we are able to find the best person for the role. And I think that will at times require it to be a judge. Not always, but will require it at times to be a judge. And so for that judge to make a decision, because it's entirely for them to make the decision, there needs to be an environment where they know that we'll be able to work constructively with them to get to the conclusion of the inquiry. And I think it has been a challenging period for some chairs.
I'd like to thank the Deputy First Minister and officials for their contributions. Just wonder if there's any further comments you feel you wish to make at this point.
No, thank you very much, as always, for your broad questions, your unexpected questions, and the manner in which you ask them.
Okay, well, thank you for that. This concludes our evidence taking on the cost effectiveness of Scottish public inquiries. We will consider all the evidence received as part of our inquiry and publish our report next month. So that concludes the public part of our meeting. We now move into private session to discuss our work programme, and I'll just call a 5-minute break to enable broadcasting and official report to leave. Thank you again to our witnesses.